This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
So in other words, even as we see this movement towards the blurring of the skills boundaries, as it were, between the polytechnic and the university sector, we're still having this backdrop of a mass higher education system that I guess makes it difficult for individuals who may want to actually contemplate a polytechnic diploma as a terminal qualification.
Apprenticeships at top financial services firms, long internship stints, intensive training. These are among the efforts by both local polytechnics and employers to draw in these students and prepare them to flourish in skilled jobs. This naturally has changed the conversation about where polytechnic education fits both into Singapore's economy as well as education system, and who a diploma is a good fit for would naturally evolve as well, not to mention the role of these institutions in relation to universities when it comes to preparing individuals to join the workforce. Heady times are ahead in Singapore's tertiary education system. Hello, I'm Tay Hong Yi. You're listening to Headstart On Record, the podcast that gives you a head start to your personal finance and career. Here to help us navigate the changes that are shaking up Singapore's tertiary education system is an education researcher who researches on education policy, curriculum design, and leadership. He's Associate Professor Jason Tan of the National Institute of Education, who is well placed for demystifying the shifts in the education landscape so that you, our audience, can better chart out your education options as you prepare yourself for your career. Welcome to the show, Prof. Tan.
Thank you very much, Hong Yi.
So let's get straight into it, Professor. We have noticed substantial efforts to enhance the curriculum in polytechnics with intensive talent and developmental schemes that include, not among other things, long internship stints at highly prestigious cutting-edge employers, research opportunities, and even overseas exposure. Where do you think this is coming from?
Well, I would say, first of all, we have to remember that the Ministry of Education for the past 2 decades or so has been actively trying to get the message across to the public about multiple pathways to success. So we're talking about the need to probably shake up the traditional hierarchy within the school landscape. And by hierarchy, I mean the way in which most of us think about progressing up the educational ladder. I think most of the time when we talk about the apex of the entire education system, we probably have in mind university. And of course, if we take a look at most charts that depict the education landscape graphically, you almost invariably find university positioned at this apex, above the polytechnics. And I remember how the Singapore government quite a few decades ago explained the clearly demarcated roles that it saw for universities and polytechnics within the wider educational landscape. So when it came to universities, there were 3 main objectives. Firstly, to provide top-level professionals, managers, planners, and researchers. Secondly, to raise the intellectual tone of society. And thirdly, to act as a benchmark in maintaining high educational standards in Singapore. Turning next to the polytechnics, the government explained that they were there to provide middle-level technologists, supervisors, and managers. So we see very clearly in the statement from over 3 decades ago, this idea of a hierarchy of qualifications. And also this hierarchy was intended to carry over eventually into the workplace as well, which I think is what you would like to be discussing today. At the same time, it's interesting to note that the Singapore government has not been in favor of allowing the polytechnics to offer degree courses or to be upgraded into universities. And this sort of transformation of polytechnics into degree-granting universities took place in Britain and Hong Kong, for example, over 3 decades ago. I think that over time what's happened is we've seen the polytechnics being progressively transformed from institutions that graduated mainly technicians, skilled technicians, to the sort of institutions that we have today that, as you pointed out a few minutes ago, are increasingly dynamic and whose course offerings definitely are very well placed in terms of workplace preparation. For example, internships, both local and overseas. So I think, as I said earlier, we are talking about the need to reconsider the previously strict hierarchy of institutions.
Yes, what it does seem to imply to me, having covered this for a few years, is that the correlation between the type of jobs that a certain qualification would prepare you for is not as strong or clear-cut as before, yet perceptions are sticky.
A word of caution here. I think that there are some professions, for instance, that definitely require university qualifications as a prerequisite for entry to them. And we're talking, for instance, about dentistry, medicine, architecture, and the law. So it's not as though the various professional bodies that govern these professions are about to change these prerequisites anytime soon. And therefore, any individuals, including polytechnic students and polytechnic graduates who have the sort of interest in entering any of these professions will definitely need to acquire a university degree along the way. So that's not going to change at all. We are also talking, I guess, about the need to balance a few things. Number one, I mentioned this hierarchy of qualifications that a lot of us have grown up with. And this includes, of course, this idea that by moving from a polytechnic to a university, you are upgrading. So in many senses, we commonly don't really tend to think of a polytechnic diploma as a terminal qualification. Then secondly, how about the messaging from the government about the need to shift from a grades-based meritocracy to a skills-based meritocracy? In other words, it's not only academic qualifications that matter, but what you can actually bring in terms of practical skills and competencies when you start working. So how do we, I guess, balance these two narratives, as it were? Yes, this idea that polytechnics are invariably subordinate to universities in terms of their qualifications and in terms of the preparedness, if you like, of their graduates, while at the same time embracing this idea that it's not just all about your qualifications per se, but more importantly about what you bring with you and what you demonstrate with you once you begin working.
I like what you said here, Prof, because this calls to mind what some employers have actually told me when they talk about their proactive efforts to really reach out to this cohort of students, that there is some subset of people who might be better off entering the workforce earlier and training on the job with the diploma as the terminal qualification, at least at the start. But then this sort of early entry is stymied by some of the worries that a diploma qualification is not adequately recognized in terms of pay and progression. That when actually it's actually better for the economy for, a given cohort to really spread out in terms of the entry rather than having a significant amount or delayed and pent up and then entering subsequently after they finish university studies. So maybe could I invite you to share some of your thoughts on some of these threats that I'm hearing from the employers?
Well, I think I'm very heartened by these sorts of employer-initiated initiatives to try and break down the previously rigid hierarchy of qualifications. And one of them, for instance, OCBC Ignite, appears very promising and exciting because I understand that they're offering an 18-month program that includes an internship and apprenticeship within the bank, with the promise, upon successful completion of the program, of being fast-tracked to become an assistant manager. So these sorts of initiatives, I think, go some way towards changing the way people think about the advantage of pursuing a polytechnic diploma and even considering the possibility that a polytechnic diploma might in fact be a terminal qualification before one enters the workforce, instead of being a transitional qualification that one acquires while on the way to university.
So these are heartening developments, but what are some challenges that you foresee that can undercut the impact of all this movement or trends towards a more fluid sort of, structuring of educational qualifications and pathways in relation to industry preparedness?
A couple of things. One of them is what I mentioned earlier, the reality that a university degree is an absolute prerequisite for entry to some professions. So in other words, this attempt to change the rigidity of the hierarchy doesn't apply equally across the board throughout various occupations, as it were. Then secondly, of course, there's the need to consider signals from employers in terms of, for instance, their hiring practices, whether they show an absolute preference for paper qualifications right at the entry point.
Pay structures.
And of course, secondly, pay structures and also promotional prospects. So it's, I guess, three things: hiring, pay structures, and promotional practices that probably play a key role in influencing quite a number of polytechnic graduates' desires, as it were, to acquire a uni qualification. And then we have recent statistics that indicate probably about a third of our recent polytechnic graduates end up moving on almost immediately to a university degree. So that's quite a substantial percentage that has been growing over the past few decades.
So, and I think that's an interesting development because it shows a certain tension there, right? Because I think there is, at least among more progressive employers, technical employers, there is an appetite to take up polytechnic graduates, especially those who have gone through certain intensive developmental programs. But this is also pitched against this entire drive to push up university cohort participation rates. How do we reconcile that?
Well, there are quite a few stakeholders involved, as you've already been pointing out. For instance, of course, the local universities have been increasing the number of polytechnic graduates that they've been admitting, and they've all been saying positive things about these polytechnic students that move on to the universities. So, of course, our local autonomous universities have a vested interest in continuing to attract polytechnic graduates to sign up for degree programs. That's quite understandable. I haven't mentioned something, which is the need to get the message through about these changes in polytechnic programs to secondary school students. And here's where I think secondary school career guidance counselors may play a crucial role. In other words, how aware are they about the dynamism that we find in our polytechnic programs? How aware are they that there are biopharmaceutical companies, banks that are more than willing to hire promising polytechnic students and graduates? Because I think unless this message comes through, then we are going to have students who aren't always able to make informed choices when it comes to selecting their educational pathways after they've completed secondary school.
And I imagine parents' beliefs also play a part as well. When parents come in with certain preconceptions from a time where there was a clearer stratification, a narrower scope, and a clearer kind of match between that qualification and a certain spectrum of roles, whereas it's all a bit more fluid and mixed now. So getting that across, I suppose that is also an issue where, depending on which course you take, certain additional programs and the ambitions of the individual versus the roles that are available in the economy by employers for that level of qualification, I think that is a conversation I suppose would need a lot of further advancement and nuancing? Any ideas on how we can take that further?
I think that we need to remember that over the past few decades, Singapore's university landscape has been substantially transformed from one that was, if you like, elite. So we're talking about 5% or so of each age cohort enrolling in one of the local universities to a situation we have now where, by all accounts, about 50% of each age cohort is enrolled in one of the local autonomous universities. And the Minister of Education announced recently that his ministry would now be talking about a lifetime cohort participation rate to try and promote the idea of lifelong education. And he mentioned a percentage, 60% of each age cohort to acquire at least a bachelor's degree from one of the local universities over the course of a lifetime. So in other words, even as we see this movement towards the blurring of the skills boundaries, as it were, between the polytechnic and the university sector, we're still having this backdrop of a mass higher education system that I guess makes it difficult for individuals who may want to actually contemplate a polytechnic diploma as a terminal qualification.
Yes, and this also bears out in the pay structures. When people see pay structures from very major employers being stratified very strictly by qualification rather than nuances in the nature through which you pursued their qualification, which can differ quite significantly, these expectations are kind of entrenched and reproduced.
Yes. So I think if we want to think about this entire issue, we have to recognize that there's diverse stakeholders out there. So I think I've mentioned a few already so far. I've talked about employers, professional bodies, parents, students, secondary school, career guidance counselors, the universities, the polytechnics. And how do we actually, I guess, move towards a situation where there's a clearer understanding of what's changing within the polytechnic landscape and how it might actually prove to be competitive for some students. So there are these sorts of, I guess, structural issues that we have to consider, I think.
Yes, and the kind of signals that are coming from all over the place for both, most importantly, the students and their parents, right, as they navigate the system and pick out what's the right option. Because I guess the worry arises that someone who might be better served for their aspirations by going through a certain pathway isn't going through that pathway. Do you think there's that elevated risk of that potentially?
Well, I guess all of us, when we make these sorts of decisions, we don't have the benefit of hindsight, do we? We always hope that we're making the best possible choice. And of course, as I said earlier, it's important for individuals to be making informed choices, not haphazard ones. And I think fundamentally, we're talking about individuals' hopes and dreams and aspirations for a better future, whether it's the parents or their students. And this is something that matters a great deal. So therefore, it's important for us to also respect individual choices, even though they may differ from the ones we would make at a personal level.
Of course, and it's on this note that I think is a very beautiful kind of note to end off this episode on, talking about the sort of broadening of choices available and how can we engender a broadening of minds in line with the broadening of choices available that can lead to flourishing and success and fulfillment. Now, I'm Tay Hong Yi from the Straits Times, and if you have any questions or personal stories to share about how well tertiary education has prepared you for work, do reach out to us. You can find the contact details in the podcast show notes. Links to my articles, the Headstart newsletter, or my LinkedIn profile can all be found there too. This podcast episode is edited by Amiru Karim. Thank you very much for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening. Do note, All analyses, opinions, recommendations, and other information in this podcast are for general information purposes only and are not intended to be relied upon as financial advice. You should not rely on them in making any decision. Please consult a fully qualified financial advisor or professional expert for independent advice and verification. To the fullest extent permitted by law, SPH Media shall not be liable for any loss arising from the use of or reliance on any analyses, opinions, recommendations, and other information in this podcast. SPH Media accepts no responsibility or liability whatsoever that may result or arise from the products, services, or information of any third parties. All opinions expressed by participants in this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of SPH Media.